Sri Aurobindo has been describing the development of religion as one of the lines through which nature prepares humanity to open to a deeper reality. And here we have seen three stages of religion. The first being primarily infra-rational, driven by certain vital instincts which are common to animals as well as early humanity. A second stage in which rationality now takes a prominent place and even tries to clean up the clutter and confusion that an infra-rational stage might have built. In the process, of course, religion itself undergoes a kind of a sharp division where its occult component tends to survive separately and its spiritual philosophy separates out. And in a large part, it is the forms of religion as well as its elements which are rooted in life, current life, which tend to coagulate. Still, there is a focal point, a special core, which is mostly separate from the rest of humanity. And this gives way to a third stage in which the secret spiritual experience and knowledge is sought to be spread and shared with all. And here he describes nature's double principle of intensive and concentrated evolution in a small space, and on the other side, expansion and extension, so that the new creation may be generalized in as large a field as possible. The tendency of this diffusion, though, is also to weaken the nature and power of the experience. There is a mixture, there's a dilution, there is an alloying, which we saw last time in detail, what each of these mean. And he says, a tendency to be invaded and aped by the lower elements of mind and life and physical nature. So here is a domain which is largely above mind and an experience that belongs properly above mind, which in the very act of spreading out has to now be accessible to a humanity which may have, even if it is largely mental, has also its own life impulses and its physical nature. And each of these three tend to reduce the content of the spiritual experience into its own terms, or imitating the forms, and so aping, but catching only a form without the content of the form. It was this mixture and alloy and invasion of the spurious, this profanation of the mysteries and the loss of their truth and significance, as well as the misuse of the occult power that comes by communication with invisible forces, that was most dreaded by the early mystics. We saw this last time. This is the second aspect. Dilution on one side, misuse of the power that comes with the occult content of the religion. And this was prevented by secrecy, by strict discipline, by restriction to a few fit initiates. And so immediately we see a sharp contrast. In order to maintain the purity and the power of the experience, you have to have this discipline, restriction, and core group of initiates who are fit and filtered only if they are fit. On the other side, if you want to reach out and extend something of that experience, which is necessary for humanity, then there is going to be all of this mixture, invasion of the spurious, loss of the sacred, and the misuse of the occult power or knowledge. But there is a third factor which comes in now, which we paused at last time. Another untoward result or peril of the diffusive movement and the consequent invasion has been the intellectual formalization of spiritual knowledge. So as soon as you reach out to the masses, and by now we assume that humanity has come to a more rational mind because we've already passed through the second phase of the religious development where intellect had come in, the mind captures. And in the very act of capturing, there is as if a reduction into forms which mind can accept. To put it in very contrasting terms, infinity flowing down into an instrument which is finite. Finite can only catch one side. And then the problem is each finite mind tries to catch its side, and you have division and conflict and even chaos. Where going up one step into the direct experience, there was an underlying unity of a multifaceted experience. That unity is lost when it comes into mind because mind is incapable of it. And so, in the reduction by mind, there are many distortions which come, which he now lists. Intellectual formalization of spiritual knowledge. A form is given, and a form necessarily limited, fixed, rigid, and into dogma. And the materialization of living practice into a dead mass of cult and ceremony and ritual. So, what was earlier a spontaneous, joyous, living experience of relating to the divine is now reduced to mass. And he uses the word dead mass because the mass has no value anymore. The mass of cult, ceremony, ritual. In the cult, there is a primary focus given to the personality. And the whole thing is built around the focal point of a person, an idol, a representation. And without that, the identity of the religion or the cult, it does not exist. And from there is the ceremony which is built around it. And the ceremony can be something quite elaborate, involving many together. So there is a ceremonial dance where all the devotees, disciples come together and go through whatever exercise that is associated with it. And the third is ritual, which now is individualized, where now you take this element which you capture and put it into a personal form. So there are 3 degrees of this reduction of what was earlier a spontaneous expression. Now, if you take an example here in the Indian context, you will find in many places today, there are people who will enter the river water or the ocean and turn to the rising sun, take water into their hands and pour it as an offering to the sun. If you ask what they are doing, depending on who you ask, they may say, I'm giving this water to the sun. And on a physical level and on a rational level, it makes no sense at all. But if the person had a living experience, he looks at the sun and sees in this physical image, form, the representation of the divine truth and the divine light. He steps into the ocean, which represents the ocean of the divine consciousness, in which this truth is seated, or of which this truth is an expression. The waters flow from the sun, so to say, as the sun rises. So you don't do the ritual when the sun has gone beyond the waters. It's connected to the waters. You enter the waters, and then what do? You are now one with the waters. But as a water, you turn to the source, as if the whole ocean, the whole of your consciousness, turning towards the source and giving itself to the divine. But how do you express that in your limited physical body with your limbs? Well, spontaneously, you take the water and flow it, push it towards the sun. And you may do that in a single gesture, or you may feel in yourself there are 3 very distinct layers of consciousness, and you may make 3 gestures for each of these layers. In each, a kind of a universal turning of consciousness towards the source to merge into the divine. Now, such a person would do this almost in a spontaneous act. And if someday he is traveling where there is no water, He may still sit down and take, where there's no ocean or river, he may still take a little bit of water in his hand, picture the sun before him, and offer. Again, a single gesture or three gestures or numbers don't matter, as long as he has the joy of this spontaneous self-giving. When this is now taken out of that context and brought into the mass and then intellectualized, some reason has to be given. What are you doing? You are offering the water to the sun. For what? To appease the sun. Now, depending on what the level of receptivity would be or how much of the experience is transmitted, it could get even to ridiculous extremes. But there is no other option. Because this experience of a living communion with the presence that is behind the sun is not accessible to all, at least not to a humanity in that phase. We may say, and this is our hope, that today humanity has sufficiently evolved that at least a beginning of the glimpse or the value of this, or of the glimpse of this experience could be had by everybody. And therein lies the potential for us to transcend religious forms and enter into a direct spiritual experience, at least for those who are ready for it. But here is the tendency of the ritual now to fix and then to limit. And then the child sees the parent do this, and the child repeats. And you ask them, what do you do? Well, my father used to do it like this. My mother used to do this. This is a very interesting story. It's a humorous one and worth sharing, though, as an example. There's let's say, a family in which the mother is now teaching the daughter how to cook fish. And so she takes the fish and then she cuts off the tail and then proceeds to prepare the fish. And then the child has learnt it. But one day the child asks, why do we cut off the tail? And then the mother says, I don't know. Let me ask my mother. So she calls up her mother, who says, I don't know, that's how my mother did it. Let me ask her. And fortunately, this grandmother is still there. And she says, oh yes, you know what? In those days, the pan we had was too small. So to make it fit into the pan, I cut off the tail. But it's an example of how one transmits and not realizing that one is transmitting. You may do it thinking that others also feel that experience, but the other does not feel the experience, captures only the form. And you will find people, for example, here in the ashram, they come, they go to the samadhi, oh, it's a sacred place, so they do whatever ritual they are supposed to do. And I've seen sometimes so mechanically, the person comes there and touches like this and then walks away. And their mind is somewhere else. They're thinking of some other work and the hand goes and then they walk. Somebody else takes incense and spins and then looks around at someone else. Why are you spinning? That's how it was done. That's how it's supposed to be done. By what? For what reason? By whom? Doesn't matter. And the fact of doing it is a satisfaction in itself. And that's why he says dead mass of ritual. But in a ceremony, it acquires a larger collective form. We may see, for example, and I draw examples from our ashram life here, that darshan was a ceremony, a sacred ceremony where the mother would come to the balcony and look at everybody who was there. And if you recall the experience or her description of it, the experience everybody had was she looked at each person. And there might be 1,000 people, but her gaze would as if pause at each face, as if pausing. And some people had the experience that in the moment where she touched their consciousness in the gaze, suddenly there was a loss of sense of time or space or something different. And the mother herself comments on this. She says, you notice that I see every single person. And then she explains what she did. So people went, they had this extraordinary experience, they came away, and some of them held it, others maybe didn't have any wonderful experience, they just saw and felt something nice, came away, went on with their work. But mother explained what she did. She said at that time, when she looked at each person, she linked her consciousness to each person present, drawing their consciousness, turning, lifting their consciousness so that the person's highest aspiration at that moment might be fulfilled. And she drew all these threads, and then she would look up and link it to the divine. And you see again, if you see the recordings of the Mother's Darshan, there's this movement where she looks at everyone and then she pauses and looks up. And that's it. After the mother withdrew from her body, the darshan stops. What do we do now? Well, we go to mother's room. And at that point, in a single file, we walk up, go up the stairs, step into her room, and come out, or to Sri Aurobindo's room. And now the sense of it is very different. Each one is going to have a darshan, a personal contact in a queue. And maybe at that time, there are people who are organizing the thing who will say, oh, we have a limited time, so we have 1,000 people or 5,000 people. Move on, don't stop. No pranams. Now, I remember still when it started, maybe 15 or 20 years ago, they put a board saying no pranams because it stops the queue. And after a while, that became the tradition. No pranam. You just go and you feel, you receive. You don't do any pranam. And that becomes like a ritual and even a falsification of the whole act. The pranam is a movement of self-giving. And if spontaneously your hands move or your head bows or your body bows, well, it should be allowed as an expression, but it slows down the queue. Now the queue movement becomes more important. And you see bit by bit the ceremony shifts in priority. To the organizers, at least now it is completing so many people. And if you don't stop by 1 p.m. and then there's still some people left, then we have to go on till 4 p.m. And our goal is to stop by 1 p.m. So you herd people quickly and you check the pace of the queue movement. The point of that whole ceremony and the experience and the living spiritual experience is as if fading in the background. Those who have it still may still feel. Others may have some effect, but not fully conscious. And for some, it is simply, oh, today's darshan, we go up, we do our darshan and get on with our life. The mother was very careful because around her things tended to form, and that's the nature of the cult. Because now the mother and her physical form becomes the focal point of the life of the ashram. So the focus on her body and her actions and her look becomes most important for people who have nothing else to hold on to. So it would always happen, whatever she did, if people had a chance to interact with her, it would quickly tend to form into a pattern. So it happened one day that she opened the window and looked out. And there were a few people standing there, and they looked up to her, and she blessed them, closed the windows, and went. And so the next day, the same people came back. It's 9 o'clock. Will mother open the window? And of course, on her side, she knew they were waiting because there was a call. She felt the call. So she went and out of her graciousness, opened the window, blessed them, and left. And then the third day and a fourth day, and then very quickly it became window darshan. So you had the morning darshan where everybody assembled under the balcony, where she brought down the force to fill everybody so that it could carry them through the whole day. The day began. And then there were those who had the opportunity, oh, it's time now, window darshan. They would rush and wait, and mother would come, and bit by bit the numbers grew. So window darshan started. Then there was vegetable darshan. When the vegetables used to come from the gardens, mother wanted to see the vegetables, and she would ask for numbers. Because it was a time when she was exploring the relationship with Mother Nature, who had agreed to collaborate in the work. So the numbers were significant for her, and she would ask how many, and she would look at the vegetables. And of course, in her consciousness, she was responding to the force of nature and the life in the vegetables who would open to her. You will recall her experience in Japan, where walking through the vegetable garden, some of the vegetables would say, take me, and another would say, not yet, I'm not ready. So her relationship was a very different one. She would come there, she would gaze on the vegetables, she would be told the numbers, and she would go back. Except that was an occasion when people could come and have vegetable darshan of mother. So people would assemble. And very quickly, a pattern would form: morning darshan, balcony darshan, window darshan, vegetable darshan, and some other birthday darshan, and it became unmanageable. And mother comments on this. And so, first chance she gets, someday there was a change of routine because she has to go out, the window darshan stops. At some point, vegetable darshan becomes not so important anymore. She uses an occasion to end that, and so on. But then a new occasion would start. And eventually, there were people who had frequent access and had learned to depend on it, and they began to miss it. So there was one sadhika who was missing so much that contact with the mother. And for a while, she had that access because when Panditji used to go to the mother for some work, she was waiting in the office. And one day, he had left behind a paper, so she rushed up after him to give the paper. Not intending to disturb the mother, she stood behind the door and waited to catch his eye and then gave the paper. And mother, of course, knew she was there, so mother waved and gave her a sweet smile. And then, of course, with that begins a new rhythm. So she would go every day, wait near the door, not intruding. But it was her way of having that closeness. When that pattern stopped, she was missing it. And mother had withdrawn from meeting people regularly for reasons of health. And so she would sit at home and consciously project herself into mother's room to have her darshan. And then come back. And after a few weeks of doing this, mother sent word to her, "You can come once a week." Because the mother saw her. The mother saw, felt her projection, and recognized that need. So, not daily, but it was granted once a week. But all this to show how, around a single focal point, which begins with an intense living experience, very quickly the form of personality, followed by the mass ceremonial forms or the ritual forms, they tend to follow. As long as there's the living force, they have a value. When they become mechanized and the spiritual content of it fades out, it has no purpose, and that's when generally mother would withdraw or end that particular form. But here, this is what he is describing. The moment there is an intellectual formalization, what would it mean? Well, morning you have to go do this, then you have to do that, then you have to do that. Why? Now imagine if you push this to a ridiculous extent. Well, every morning 9 o'clock you have to stand before this window. And then somebody comes behind the window and opens it as if to give you a glimpse of the mother and closes it. It would serve no purpose. But you could have your window darshan sitting where you are at home at any time of the day, isn't it? You open the window of your heart and feel the presence of the mother in your heart. And so the truth of it is still there, but that form of it has lost purpose. How do you choose? How do you recognize? There are still people, in the mornings you will see some of them stop at the mother's balcony and stand under the balcony and concentrate. As long as they feel that contact and the darshan and the blessing, it serves their purpose. But there are others who have done that a few times and then after a while, okay, it's just taking my time, I don't feel anything, it fades out. So in a framework which is not organized by centralized religion, but allowed to flow freely in the living force of experience, this kind of change is acceptable. But if you make a religious structure out of it, then someone not doing it would be told, hey, you are not doing the right thing, or you're missing out on something, or you're going to get good luck or bad luck, or whatever mental form one may give to it. So that's how many of the, what we call beliefs and practices which seem to be rational tend to form. But so he says, formalization of spiritual knowledge into dogma, that's one side of the distortion, and the other is materialization of living practice into a dead mass of cult and ceremony and ritual. a mechanization by which the spirit was bound to depart in course of time from the body of the religion. So the moment mechanization comes, that force which was the living experience tends to fade. Because why are you doing it? Because you have to do it, not because you're feeling the call or the presence. Now take this to most of the religions which are well known. In Buddhism, you will see many of the practices which at some point become so mechanical. You go to a monastery, you'll find prayer wheels. Sometimes they have 108 prayer wheels all around the monastery. And the monk will walk spinning each one of them, completing his 108. And if that's part of the daily ritual, well, he's doing it. And if he's doing it because it's a ritual to be done, his mind is somewhere else. His hand is mechanically spinning, or even missing a few, and somehow it doesn't matter. That's all he's doing, spinning wheels. But if there's someone who's very conscious about it, you can see he is concentrated, and with each spin of the wheel, there's a certain intentionality which may even build up into a strong experience. But how many do that? Rare to see, increasingly. Or you may take in Islam or in Christianity similar forms of rituals where if you see them do it, you can feel whether they are experiencing something or not. And in most cases, you find this decline into mere mechanical ritual. And even some people are saying, okay, when do I get home now? It's time, when will it finish? Or there's a sermon going on, I have to sit through, maybe suffer this. Even the word preach, which at one point represented a sacred exercise of revealing a spiritual insight or teaching, is in the popular language in English turned into a negative connotation. Oh, stop preaching to me, we say. Preaching has a negative turn now. He hammered away at the pulpit. These are all phrases which have come into the English language. So the priest is seen as somebody who's very intolerant, who's hammering away some force of his belief, as if drilling it into his people. And that is how you correspond now to a politician who's trying to exercise his influence on people. But all of these show you that the symbols have become so hardened that, at least in the common popular usage, they have lost force. And in the course of time, it only gets worse. But, Sri Aurobindo says, this risk had to be taken, for the expansive movement was an inherent necessity of the spiritual urge in evolutionary nature. So now we come back to who is it that is driving this whole development of religion, or of occultism, or of the rest of the lines. Nature is pushing in the hearts of people, in the collective consciousness, this turn. She is choosing, molding, shaping. She builds these concentrated focal points, and when sufficiently developed, she triggers the spread and the expansion. And when there has been too much dilution, she again concentrates a few centers to revivify, again to be spread out. Of course, nature from below, in a sense. Behind nature, above, is the divine consciousness, working equally from above to assist. So what we see is a double movement. In the impulse within us is nature pushing from inside towards something which we don't know what, we just feel the push. And on the other side is the divine consciousness, free, conscious, superconscious, calling us, drawing us, and sometimes linking and filling us with a touch of an experience. And every now and then, one meets somebody who says, I went for that ritual, temple, exercise, whatever it was. And as we sat, as I did my asanas, as I did my prayer, as I listened to the chant, suddenly I had this extraordinary experience. And out of the blue, the fellow has no interest, looking for nothing particular, but something touches, something awakes, and his life is changed, and now he begins to seek that. And that did not come from nature pushing from inside, that came from above, from the divine consciousness pulling or filling. So we have actually a carrot and stick, so to say, something pushing from inside, and because it's more instinctive, we are not conscious, but there's also something supra-rational, a conscious presence that also assists wherever it gets a chance, wherever it finds a ready person, a nudge, a push. And the two really work together because nature is ultimately a lesser, less conscious expression of that creative knowledge, working now in a more dulled and darkened matter. So, evolutionary nature has this spiritual urge. I want to grow and awaken, return to my source, rediscover that divinity. And in that, the necessity of nature to build a focal point, we have understood, we have seen before, because the evolution takes place first in individuals. The collective never changes spontaneously. It is individuals changing which makes for the collective change. So she has to concentrate first in an individual, then a cluster of individuals, and then she has to widen out. So the risk had to be taken. And for nature, given enough time, there is no risk really, isn't it? The risk of dilution is only if you have a deadline to meet. But if you have eternity, you say, well, okay, it will dilute. I will again create a special focal point and again spread and again until eventually it's done. How long doesn't matter. I'm not in a hurry. And that was the mother's conversation with Mother Nature. She said, I was trying to convince Mother Nature. And Mother Nature is not in a hurry. She's enjoying her journey. And the mother said, she feels that I am too much in a hurry. And at some point, the mother made that breakthrough and she said, nature has agreed to collaborate. And so things will happen much faster. So, with this, Sri Aurobindo completes the description of this third phase of the spiritual turn through religion. Now he describes the particular context, historical forms, and the variations that could be in this process. So this paragraph we completed describes in essence. And then we will see broadly two different patterns, one which took place in the West and one which took place in the East. Thus came into being the religions which rely mainly or in the mass on creed and ritual for some spiritual result, but yet hold, because of their truth of experience, the fundamental inner reality that was initially present in them and persists so long as there are men to continue or renew it. A means for those who are touched by the spiritual impulse to realize the divine and liberate the spirit. So now we see the role of the religion here. Even though all this has happened, mass of creed and ritual, the religion is relying on the mass of creed and ritual for its spiritual outcome. But it can continue because there is the force of the truth within. That same thing which began the first impulse of that religious turn, there's a fundamental inner reality that was initially present in them. And then he says, how long will it stay? Persists so long as there are men to continue or renew it. That impulse, the spiritual impulse of the experience, as long as there are men to continue or renew it. In the religion, you will find, therefore, a large mass which may not feel the experience. But if there is a core that holds the experience, or even if the experience fades, there are a few who can renew it and give to it a new form, new force, new energy, new life, new meaning, then that religion will continue. Now this opens to us a profound insight. If nature has built this vehicle, let's say a particular religion, and inevitably in its journey there is going to be this dilution and loss and formalization and materialization, nature's purpose would be lost unless there are such people who are able to hold or renew. So what does nature do? She makes sure there are people who hold and renew. Or let's now take it in a broader sense, nature, capital N, including divine nature as well as a more material nature. We'll look at the big picture now, whatever the wisdom behind. She will ensure that as a particular movement of religion loses its spiritual content, someone is born. The divine puts out an emanation, or a special soul comes, who revivifies, gives new force, gives new meaning to the same symbols, reminds people of their deeper content. But he has to come with a certain force and intensity of his experience that can be transmitted to others. And then you find this renewal that takes place. Sometimes, though, if the religion is too formalized, in the movement of religion, in the movement of renewal, the formalized part rejects this awakening and says, "You are not us," and throws it out. And you see a split in the religion. And a form develops, which continues this, while the other one fades out or is subsumed into this, and it has served its purpose. So initially there's always resistance and opposition, but inevitably, if the force of experience is strong, that's what survives. All the rest breaks down anyway. Persist so long as there are men to continue or renew it. A means, and this is the whole form of religion, a means for those who are touched by the spiritual impulse to realize the divine and liberate the spirit. It was in soon after the mother had left her body, when there was a lot of doubt among people what would happen to the ashram, because there was no formal head. She did not anoint a central power, authority, control structure, and deliberately. Precisely had she done that, you would have seen the birth of another religious type. She said, let the truth lead. And as long as people are able to align to the truth, they will find the forms relevant at that moment. And so there was doubt in many people, will it continue? And Nolinida was asked, what will happen? What's the future of the ashram? And he said something to this effect. As long as there is one person who is practicing Sri Aurobindo's yoga, the ashram will continue. Simple enough answer, but the principle behind is this, that someone holds the living experience, or a group, or in the community, even if it is a large spread of a thinned experience, at least it should be a living content. Otherwise, eventually the forms fail, which is what we see in so many of the forms of religions. And particularly in the last 30 years, you will see increasingly young people refusing to join monastic orders in all religions, without exception. And as a result, the religions themselves are losing followers, or at least their monastics. The infrastructure which is run by monastics is breaking down. In Europe, you find churches being sold off by the central body because they don't have people to run them. And who buys them up? And these are immigrants coming with some other tradition, or new age people coming with their own particular line of experience. And you'll see very interestingly, there are many religious groups from India which have bought up the churches and then redone them. Some of them very respectful of the fact that this used to be a church, and they keep some of the icons out of respect for those who have used it before, and then bring their own forms and their own rituals, and so on. But you see, things which do not have a living force, which is the case for the monastic component, except for a few, it no more has a living purpose in current evolution and the purpose of nature. You find them breaking down. So I generally summarize it in this way. Now we use it in the context of the religion, but we have to summarize it for our lives equally. Whatever is true, whatever has a grain of truth or a force of deeper experience, will survive come what may. Whatever does not have grain of truth or force of living experience will die come what may. And if you apply it to your own life, apply it to relationships, apply it to your forms, your personal rituals of life. You know, ever since my grandmother died, I have always been doing this for her. But this year I can't do it because I'll be traveling. I feel bad. But you can ask yourself, well, is it still a living force for me? If so, it doesn't matter where I am in the world, I can still do it. If it doesn't have the force, well, it will fade out. Eventually, it will become harder and harder to do. And one year I'll forget. And a week later, I remember, oh, that was the day I've forgotten. Well, it has lost its force. If it does not have a grain of truth or a living force, it will fade come what may. You cannot cling to it. Or it will pass with you. Your children or grandchildren won't continue it, because it means nothing to them. On the other hand, if there's a force of truth in an act, in a relationship, in a memory, in an object, nothing can destroy it. The forms may change. The way I relate to it, the way I'm now friends with X, with whom I was once in whatever way, forms may change. But if there is a living experience of value, of something, of substance, nothing will ever destroy it. And so when we think in such terms, we no more fear change in life. Change is always of forms, and the change is inevitable. The truth, in its essence, is eternal. That's why it's truth. Something which is not eternal would not be true. It would still be form of something else which might be true, but in itself would not be a truth. And that's how we distinguish truth from form of expression of truth, isn't it? So when we begin to view things in terms of their essential permanence, in terms of their spiritual core or content of experience, that will never be lost. And we have nothing to fear. And all the changes of life are there only to assist the regeneration or re-expression of this truth in new forms, which are more living, more relevant for the present and the future. And these are all means for us to grow in the divine, towards the divine consciousness. So this development, so mass of creed and ritual in the religion now becomes the norm. This development has led farther to a division into two tendencies: Catholic and Protestant. One, a tendency towards some conservation of the original plastic character of religion, its many-sidedness and appeal to the whole nature of the human being. The other, disruptive of this Catholicity and insistent on a pure reliance on belief, worship, and conduct, simplified so as to make a quick and ready appeal to the common reason, heart, and ethical will. So these are two tendencies. Initially, they may emerge in the same movement, but they very quickly separate because in form they are so different, even opposite to each other. So the names he's using, you will see, match precisely the split that took place in Christianity in Europe at a certain point. But the very vocabulary and the description of it is not limited to Europe. You will find it takes place in every religion. The word Catholic is precisely this: something universal, something multifaceted, something inclusive. Protestant is precisely this, in a reaction to that, to go to something which is more limited or tangible. So for the Catholic movement, that which is more multifaceted, one, a tendency towards some conservation of the original plastic character of religion. Remember, now religion is being reduced to creed and ritual. And someone says, no, but we have to hold on to that plastic character. Don't reduce it. Don't make it too rigid. And in that attempt, it's trying to hold also its many-sidedness and appeal to the whole nature of the human being. So in the religion itself, in the living spiritual experience at the core of the religion, because it is the meeting of the infinite, many sides to it. And it appeals, different parts in us are drawn to it in different ways. There is the aspect of bhakti, of the love of the heart. There's the knowledge aspect and a deeper understanding. And then there is the worship and the action and the consecration and whatever form it may be. All the parts of us are somehow included. Even in the experience of the divine, there is the aspect of the divine which transcends. There is the divine which is formed in its universality, and then there is the divine who is individualized, perhaps. And you will see this in the Trinity of the Catholic teaching. But there's as if something which meets all. And if we go far enough, even in the Christian tradition, you will find there are the both sides of the masculine and the feminine, God and the Mother of God, as how they put it sometimes, or Virgin Mary, which represents what? Now, when we are entering in a very interesting passage of which Mother and Sri Aurobindo have both said many interesting things. And some of those are quite scattered, and I tried to put together everything, but it becomes too much. But I'll summarize in my own words rather than reading out from it. Mother shares an experience, it's recorded in the agenda, where she says that in the living tradition at the core of the Catholic Church, they still retain the mystical content of the teaching. And she said she had a friend who was a bishop, and no, sorry, not a bishop, a cardinal. She had a friend who was a cardinal, and he shared with her how, at the level of cardinals, they still teach you that mystical content, but under oath of secrecy. And one wonders why, but anyway. And he shared that they teach you that Virgin Mary represents nature. And she gives some examples of that kind. But the idea being that this understanding that these are symbols of some deeper truth, and there is a meeting of the divine in so many facets or through in so many gateways, appealing to different natures within the human variety. And that is the character of this attempt to hold plasticity and many-sidedness. So, many-sidedness of the teaching and the experience, but also the appeal to the whole nature of our being. So there's one side of me that wants to experience the divine as mother, and another part which wants to experience the divine as father. And there's a qualitative difference in the relationships. But there's another side which wants to experience the divine as my child, or my friend, or as my teacher, or whatever form. So in the Bhakti tradition, especially in India, you will find all of these are accepted, and they even categorize all the different extremes and specializations of the relationships possible. And you're freely allowed to have all these simultaneously, or whichever calls to your heart. Now, if you go back to the roots of many of the religions, you'll find elements of all these present. But if you see the lineage developed in specific areas, they catch one side and fix it. So you'll find in some of the churches, the whole focus is on Virgin Mary carrying baby Christ, or she holds Christ in front and the baby is now the focus. Or in the Christmas ceremony, the baby Christ is the focus, and the others somehow recede. Or in others, there's a very stoic sense of a masculine God, which is quite terrorizing. Or somewhere else, it is just the Virgin Mary with nothing else. Mother, and that's all, and it stops there. And many variations. The angelic beings come, which represent special sides. 4 angelic beings, interestingly, 4 archangels in the Christian tradition. And you wonder, why 4? And then you find the correspondence in the Indian tradition with the 4 aspects of the Divine Mother. And the aspect of wisdom, aspect of force, aspect of harmony, aspect of perfection and beauty. And you wonder, is there a correspondence? You explore a little bit on the 4 archangelic names and you'll find almost a perfect correspondence, except they're described as male. But when you see them painted, especially in the old traditions, their appearance is almost feminine. And at least in the more mystical traditions, they're described as being genderless. So something interesting which is held. But then as you pass into the later years, they're reduced, made more masculine, given a gender, given a certain personality, which is more and more narrow and fixed. And you lose the direct experience of that glimpse. But still in the name of the 4 archangels, you'll find the sense of what they represent. And so you can trace back to the truth behind, and because that is still there, they still have a force. So a ritual built around that, or a church built with those symbols and images of the angels or archangels and so on, will still have a force, a certain effect, because of the power of the symbol in that space. But you're losing the many-sidedness. At the same time, though, there's this other side, the other disruptive of this Catholicity. It's rebelling against it. It wants to remove that. And insistent on a pure reliance on belief, worship, conduct, simplified so as to make a quick and ready appeal to the common reason, heart, and ethical will. So in the Protestant form, there is a reduction to something which is easily accessible. And the 3 forms in which it is made accessible, I should be able to understand, I should be able to feel in the heart, and then there is the ethics of my behavior. These are the three things, because they have to touch these three parts. Remember, the spiritual experience has to settle into these three. But in the very act of doing that, you have to simplify. You keep some minimum belief, worship, and conduct. You must do this every day. Here's the worship, this is what you believe, and then you are fine. You are part of our religion. When you see the historical context in which it took place in Europe, there are many interesting angles. I was looking at some literature that said 8 broad distinctions between the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church. And there are now many Protestant churches. So the Catholic Church has one major center. The Pope is supposed to be the head, formally authorized, and some historical reason is given. This other side says, no, that's not the case. We are not going to follow this one Pope. We are only interested in relating to God. And so it allows for many different streams of the Protestant forms to develop. Each still uses the reference of the Bible, but each may even reinterpret the Bible or rewrite it to some extent and still say we are following the same lineage or the same tradition. And so you have many, many numbers, going into thousands, I'm told, into denominations of all kinds, but all of them swear to be in the Protestant. But if you see other aspects of it, they rebel against certain strict and rigid elements of the Catholic teaching. For example, in the Catholic training, the priest has to be celibate. In the Protestant, they throw that out. And why? And you'll go back, you'll find historical elements of it. Because it took place at a time when the church controlled this, demanded this, prevented people from remarrying and so on. And eventually they said, no, we don't want that. We just want our thing. And there's nothing here wrong with this. Whatever form, the particular form of it is not important, but the fact of redefining what meant and was meaningful, what was living at that point. But in that very act of simplifying, you have lost so much. And so he says, this turn has tended to create an excessive rationalization, a discrediting and condemnation of most of the occult elements which seek to establish a communication with what is invisible, a reliance on the surface mind as the sufficient vehicle of the spiritual endeavor. So what happened in the elements of the Catholic Church teaching were these rituals by which you created as if an access to a higher grade or invoked a certain power. You see this still intact in the Orthodox churches, where the huge complex ritual forms try to preserve something of this, and there's a whole dramatic element around it. But you can feel also an element of the occult force and construction behind, which is still intact. In the Roman Catholic Church, this has become more monotone, more narrow, focused around one narrow structure. And then in the Protestant movement, somehow this has completely been lost. And Mother comments about this. It would be wonderful, she says, if the two could come together, because the Catholic movement holds the occult power and the Protestant movement has something which is much more of a living experience, which people want to live by or they follow because they feel spontaneously something. But in that act, that linking element which was held somehow has been reduced because you have reduced it to reason. Living experience is not important, understanding is important. And with understanding, of course, you mechanize and superficialize. So surface mind is sufficient vehicle of the spiritual endeavor. In the very formulation, you can see it's ridiculous. Mind could not be enough to develop your spiritual consciousness. Mind can be an entry point, a gateway, but it has to turn to something either deeper within itself or higher above it. And the moment you've brought it to mind, now it's accessible by all intellectual elements of society. And what happens? The intellectual elements now take this and further begin to reduce by intellect. Why are we doing this? This doesn't make sense. Throw it out. That makes more sense. Change it. And so the mind is now defining forms. A certain dryness and a narrowness and paucity of the spiritual life have been a frequent consequence. So in the very vocabulary you see, he's not talking of just that one event in Europe. You'll find a similar movement in Buddhism. You'll find a similar movement in Hindu traditions, in the Islamic tradition, and so on. In Buddhism, for example, you'll see two big divisions. Both aim at nirvana, but there is the Mahayana, which is translated as great Mahayana vehicle. Here is a great vehicle which lifts you. It's great because it has a multifaceted, multidimensional content to the experience. And so they have all these gods and they have all these rituals and all these complex procedures and books and teachings and lineages of various teachers. It's quite complex. And you can get lost in those complexities. And on the other side, that part which says, no, we don't want to get lost in this complexity. So kind of a hard barrenness that comes with the what was called Hinayana. Hina, the word itself means a reduced vehicle. So the complexity is thrown out and an essential component held, and with it comes a barrenness. Because you're trying to make simpler, you try to remove all the embellishments. What remains is hard, sharp, ascetic. Of course, because Hinayana meant in comparison, it seems to be less. So the tradition itself renamed today, they don't like the word Hinayana, but until 50 years ago it was quite common. Now they call themselves Theravada, to not call yourself lesser vehicle, but in that you'll find this exaggerated monastic tradition. Everything is reduced to the barest minimum, and the formal teaching of understanding becomes now prominent. The heart content has been as if weakened or even lost. So dryness, narrowness, and paucity, not enough of the spiritual juice, have been a frequent consequence. Moreover, the intellect, having denied so much, cast out so much, has found ample room and opportunity to deny more until it denies all. So you just gave the whole responsibility to the intellect. And so it keeps on doing. At first, not so obviously, but given enough time, let's say every generation says, well, we're supposed to be focusing on the real thing, so why are we wasting time on XYZ? Knock it out. Because they have lost the feeling associated, the living force of experience. But there's still something remaining which they feel has a force of experience. A generation down where they don't feel that, why are we doing this? Knock it out. And so it keeps going. And at some point, there are the scholars who come and they start squabbling over, is it like this? Is it like that? And then further reduce to logic. Opportunity to deny more until it denies all. To negate spiritual experience and cast out spirituality and religion, leaving only intellect itself as the sole surviving power. Now, when we read it like this, it sounds so ridiculous. Because we started with an attempt to realize a spiritual truth, and all we have done is the power of the intellect. But it's not so ridiculous when you see the lineages which now live this, and they're happy with just that. So if you go back to a certain period in Europe, you had the monks whose only job was study the scriptures, learn by heart the scriptures, or copy the scriptures, and that's all they did. Or understand or discuss occasionally, that's about it. You can follow your routine, whatever was given, prescribed. But that was enough. That was your spirituality. Or you will see in a lot of the philosophy as it survives today, or let's say in the last 100 years, it's mere play of ideas. But if you go back to the root of the word philosophia, to Greece, philo is this adoring love to Sophia, goddess of knowledge. So an adoring love to the goddess of knowledge is not mere intellectual argument. It's as if almost a spiritual experience opening to the wisdom that can fill you as you open your heart to her. She's a goddess, she's a conscious being, and you have a relationship. So philosophia, if you go back long enough, and I don't know how many thousand years, was in fact this worship of the goddess of knowledge. Reduced now to mere intellectual discourse, debate. And it doesn't matter. Just you learn what you need to pass an exam. Now you're a philosopher. No, you're not. Or you see even in India today, there are lineages, and I'm thinking of one that I have had frequent contact with, where the founder never meditated. Meditation had no meaning. Study of scripture, understanding the Vedantic texts was all. And you will find in that lineage extraordinary scholars. They know everything from here and there. They've studied all the nuances of all the different philosophical, darshanas, the schools of knowledge, and they can do everything, but where is the spiritual content? And you miss it. And you miss it to such a degree that it happened in this particular school that I'm thinking of, where two of the persons one day realized that their teacher was not a self-realized being. And in the shock of that recognition, they broke away from the school and started their own school. But then if you think about it logically, did they start teaching because of their own foundation of self-realization? No. But what was wrong with their teacher, who was not teaching from a self-realized poise either? Why did they break away? And it doesn't make sense. But that's the way it works when the intellect leads. And for them, it was enough that they studied and understood that all this is essentially Brahman. Or Brahman is the ultimate reality, the world is an illusory appearance. Whatever the particular form they articulate. That they understood this, and in the mind's understanding, they began to relate to the world in this way. That was all. That was their spirituality. There was not even the idea that you can enter into a living experience of this truth or this partial truth. That idea was not there. Or the system or the lineage justified itself saying, when you live in this long enough, eventually when you shed your body, you will merge into that. So they convinced themselves that was all they needed to do. So you will see this everywhere in all the religions. Now what happens next? Intellect is the sole surviving power. There's no spiritual power behind, or it's got so badly concealed you don't find it anymore. The intellect, void of the spirit, can only pile up external knowledge and machinery and efficiency, and ends up in a drying up of the secret springs of vitality. Now already the springs of vitality were there, even if they were secret. And sometimes they were bound in religions or certain beliefs or certain elements of experience which were felt or transmitted. As long as they were there, although they were secret, they juiced the experience. They filled people and somehow kept the reality of things. But now that dries up. Machinery, efficiency is all that works. And a decadence without any inner power to save the life or create a new life or any other way out than death and disintegration and a new beginning out of the old ignorance. So what's left eventually, when nothing can create or new life can come, the whole thing breaks down and maybe a new beginning emerges or not. So here Sri Aurobindo completes this paragraph describing this split that takes place. And in the next paragraph now, he takes up the alternate. And I'll briefly read of this, but then we'll go to explore a little bit of the difference between the Catholic and the Protestant aspect in some of others' writings of Sri Aurobindo or in the mother's writing. So here he says, in the next paragraph, it would have been possible for the evolutionary principle to have preserved this pristine wholeness of movement while pressing on. It need not have broken up like this. It could have. Nature, finally, remember, nature is the driver. She could have prevented this drying up aspect or this exaggerated mentalization. She could have held back and pulled it and allowed it to weaken or fade out. So it is possible to preserve the pristine wholeness by an expansion and not a disruption of the wiser ancient harmony. Remember, in the Protestant, in the very word, you see the reaction against a breaking away. And so a disruption, continuity lost. But instead there could have been an expansion even into intellect, but without the disruption. To a greater synthesis of the principle of concentration and the principle of diffusion. The two moving together, but not breaking away from each other. That's also possible. And then he says, in India, we have seen there has been a persistence of the original intuition and the total movement of evolutionary nature. For religion in India limited itself by no one creed or dogma. It not only admitted a vast number of different formulations, but contained successfully within itself all the elements that have grown up in the course of the evolution of religion, and refused to ban or excise any. So all these components which got pushed out as there was intellectualization, they were all kept there. And so he lists them. It developed occultism to its utmost limits, accepted spiritual philosophies of all kinds, followed to its highest, deepest, or largest outcome every possible line of spiritual realization, spiritual experience, spiritual self-discipline. Its method has been the method of evolutionary nature herself, to allow all developments, all means of communication and action of the spirit upon the members, all ways of communion between man and the supreme or divine, to follow every possible way of advance to the goal and test it even to its extreme. So here's the potential. Let's explore. What's it like to have spirituality completely cut off from life? Well, there's a lineage which will follow that. And another which says, what's it like to have spirituality so embedded in life that you cannot differentiate? Well, here's another lineage that goes that extreme. And every possible thing to be attempted. And everywhere there is something as if which holds the thread that says, yes, it all comes from one multifaceted origin, and innumerable ways representing itself. And each one has its own way, and each collectivity, each lineage can develop its own. And so there is this inherent to the idea that as your experience grows sufficiently deep, you are free to branch out and form your own particular way of experience, way of growth, way of pursuit of religion or of practice. And then people who enter are drawn to that facet which resonates closest to them. And it fills. And then certain lineages fade out, weaken because there's no one interested in them. Others grow stronger. And it's a fluid, free movement. So this is possible. Here, of course, we have quickly read through. We will look at some examples of each of these. What does he mean by deepest or largest outcome possible of every line of spiritual realization? We'll look at some interesting examples of these. But for now, I want to pause and turn our attention to two texts in particular. In one, Sri Aurobindo is describing in the human cycle this same split of the Catholic and the Protestant. And the way he formulates it, it's the same idea of what we have read, but much more detailed. And I will read somewhat slowly and pause only where absolutely necessary. Religious forms and systems become effete. Effete means losing force, losing vitality. Become effete and corrupt and have to be destroyed. Or they lose much of their inner sense and become clouded in knowledge and injurious in practice. And in destroying what is effete or in negative aberrations, reason has played an important part in religious history. So here the starting point is slightly different. He shows how any form and system tends to become corrupt or lose vitality because knowledge is always clouded, practices tend to become exaggerated, and so reason comes in to help religion. Okay, so the perspective is different. Reason is actually a force used by nature. But in its endeavor to get rid of the superstition and ignorance which have attached themselves to religious forms and symbols, intellectual reason, unenlightened by spiritual knowledge, tends to deny. So here is superstition and ignorance mixed into religion, but intellect comes, it doesn't understand the living force of the spiritual experience. So tends to deny, and so far as it can, to destroy the truth and the experience which was contained in them. So the moment you've thrown out, let's say, a superstition, it had a core of truth or some experience which gave it birth originally, which is now lost in the form of the superstition. So as this intellect throws out the form, it throws out also the truth. And what's a good superstition that we often read about today, and it's an example I've taken before, the eclipse. Every time there is a major eclipse, you'll find in the newspapers, there is nothing to worry about. There is no danger. You don't have to wash yourself or take a shower, or you don't have to fear anything. And it's true to the extent that people used to fear the eclipse. So, oh, eclipse is coming. No, we won't do this, we won't do that. It's an exaggerated response. But there's a truth to something that happens during the eclipse, and an occult content to it, not a spiritual value, but an occult content, which is thrown out when you say, oh, it's nothing, you can actually drink water, eat what you like, nothing will happen. No, that's not true. There is a difference. And interestingly, that rationality, which is rejecting the form and the truth behind it, the same rationality, if it goes deeper, discovers the truth behind it, or at least superficially, when it finds, and using scientific tools and experiments, that during the solar eclipse, within that half an hour or so, the bacteria count in the air shoots up and triples in a short time. And so they say, how do we explain this? So the reason says, oh, it must be because the ultraviolet rays are not coming in. They're blocked. Ultraviolet rays kill the bacteria. And if you again apply the reason, you would say, but at night then the bacteria count should shoot up even more. It doesn't happen. It does go up, but not so much. So what is it during the eclipse that it can go up so much more than at night, for no other explanation that we can physically have? And so there the intellect stops and turns away. That's not our domain. Avoids facing something which is inconvenient, which is commonly the case. But if that intellect had a spiritual turn or an occult insight and was more broad, recognizing that beyond the material there is also a subtle and occult many layers of reality, it could begin to explore those using the same power of intellect. The problem, though, is the superficial intellect is incapable of entering that domain. It needs an intuitivized intellect. And of this, Sri Aurobindo will make reference. So, reformations which give too much to reason and are too negative and Protestant usually create religions which lack in wealth of spirituality and fullness of religious emotion. They are not opulent in their contents. Their form and too often their spirit is impoverished, bare and cold. Now you see, these, you will pause and just say these are words which describe almost with a poetic turn of phrase, but actually they are literal turn of phrase equally. The tradition itself becomes impoverished, bare and cold. Well, look at the most ascetic traditions. They are poor, isn't it? In their very attempt to turn away, they celebrate poverty because physical wealth even is considered to be a trap. And you will see this in all the Protestant forms, a celebration of poverty and an exaggerated importance given to poverty. And then the tradition itself now lives in poverty in celebration of its greatness in being poor or bare. All the fine beauty and aspect of worship of beauty is gone. Things are reduced to a minimum and cold. If this continues long enough, the heart itself and the love in the heart has no point of expression or access or nourishment. Heart becomes cold. And often the leaders of such traditions, they are so cold in their behavior. And the more high they are in the hierarchy of the religious system, the more cold they tend to be. And so I narrate an incident that the mother gives in a narration. I think it's in the agenda. She says, as a child, she had gone to one of the churches, and she would sense these things from the beginning. And so she would go to see what's happening, what is really the thing behind. And sometimes she has described, in one of the churches, she saw this gigantic spidery being which was sucking the energy of all the people who came. It was a very dark experience. But elsewhere, in another church, she was a young child at the time, she saw this priest going into this box where the confession is to take place, and she saw him hard and cold, and he goes in. And then this young lady comes full of sweetness and softness and charm. She sits inside. And mother said, I didn't know what they were talking. It was in Italian. I didn't understand. But after a while, that girl started sobbing. And then she collapsed, sobbing and crying. And this priest opens his door and pushes her body with his door. And in this very cold, smug, self-satisfied way, walks out. His task done. And mother said something so horrible. Like she would have said that this is the most horrible thing. And then she explains, it was not the religion which was horrible, but it was this aspect of the religion which had become so horrible. So this bare and cold is literally what people become. It's not just the lineage itself. It makes humanity impoverished, bare and cold. Nor are they really rational. So they start by being rational, nor are they really rational. For they live not by their reasoning and dogma, which to the rational mind is as irrational as that of the creeds they replace, still less by their negations, but by their positive quantum of faith and fervor, which is supra-rational in its whole aim, and has too its infra-rational elements. So if you see, the fervor of the Protestant is not rational. And if he doesn't have that fervor, well, he was not going to survive. The movement will fade out. But in that fervor of being Protestant, you see, it's not a rational thing. If he was truly rational, he would say, all right, this is what I believe. What do you believe? Let's see logically what works. But the fervor of the Protestant is, you're not Protestant, then you are cut off. Or even as it was in Europe for a long time, you're killed. Each side would kill the other. And it took a while for political leaders to say, okay, we have to be tolerant of the other. But tolerant meant you are totally against them, but you tolerate their existence. That is infra-rational. It's not even a supra-rational truth. And so there's a supra-rational component, there's an infra-rational component. The very thing they've criticized in the other, they have. If these seem less gross to the ordinary mind than those of the less questioning creeds, it is often because they are more timid in venturing into the realm of supra-rational experience. So on this side, they don't dare to enter the supra-rational more, so they seem to be more reasonable. That's all. So now he explains what needs to be done. The life of the instincts and impulses of its religious side cannot be satisfyingly purified by reason, but rather by being sublimated, by being lifted up into the illuminations of the Spirit. That's what you need. So the natural line of religious development proceeds always by illumination. You cannot develop religion by logic. You can only develop by illumination, because that is its true nature. And religious reformation acts best when either it re-illuminates rather than destroys old forms, or, where destruction is necessary, replaces them by richer and not by poorer forms. So here you find the key. How do you take forward a religion? Not by destroying the forms. You have to bring back the light into those forms. But if the forms are so lost that now they need to be destroyed, well, you replace them by a richer form, not by a lesser form. Now here's your clue of what needs to be done in all the religions. This is what, in part, Sri Aurobindo and the mother also attempted, not directly engaging with the religions, but in the writings, in Sri Aurobindo's writings, when he comments on certain religious traditions or their beliefs, he brings into them the fresh, deeper truth of their symbolism or the forms in which they can grow into. But equally, that's the kind of force they put out for the change in the world. It's what you will see in the turn in what we generally broadly call New Age awakening. Some go back into their religious roots to revivify. Others break the form and replace by something which is more satisfying and more rich. But in the very act of breaking out, they catch elements of those forms and give to it a new figure. And then he says, and in any case, when it purifies by supra-rational illumination, not by rational enlightenment. So, how do you bring the light? From something of a higher experience, not by logic filling it. A purely rational religion could only be a cold and bare deism, worship of deity. And such attempts have always failed to achieve vitality and permanence, for they act contrary to the dharma, the natural law and spirit of religion. Now, in modern times, you actually find this. Scientology is one of those rationally formed religion. They call it Scientology because it's scientific, rationally formulated teaching. The founder, having gone and visited all over the world, supposedly, and learned from all the religions, brings now together that which is most rational and practical to help you grow in what? Not in divine consciousness, but in your capacity as a human being to maximize it. So again, the spiritual component is gone because reason rules, and it can only exaggerate the powers of the intellect and animal instincts. So now he comes to the explanation. What do we need to do? If reason is to play any decisive part, it must be an intuitive rather than an intellectual reason. So an intuitive reason will be this and the reason turning and trying to feel beyond itself, and then trying to articulate what it feels. Touched always by spiritual intensity and insight. And so he explains further the whole rationale, and I will skip all that. This is from the Human Cycle, the chapter titled Reason and Religion, if you're interested to read further. And then there's something else which I wanted to read from the mother's classes that she took with children and with the Ashramites, 1955. She read a particular letter of Sri Aurobindo where there was this term, to seek after the impersonal, that is the divine as impersonal, beyond personal form. Someone asks mother, what does to seek after the impersonal mean? And mother explains this. Oh, it's very much in fashion in the West, my child. 1955. All those who are tired or disgusted with the God taught by the Chaldean religions, and especially by the Christian religion, a single God, jealous, severe, despotic, and so much in the image of man that one wonders if it is not a demiurge, as Anatole France said. Demiurge, almost like an Asuric being. These people, when they want to lead a spiritual life, no longer want the personal God, because they're too frightened lest the personal God resemble the one that they have been taught about. They want an impersonal Godhead, something that doesn't at all resemble, or as little as possible, the human being. That's what they want. So you see the need for this. When the relationship with God or the idea of God has been so warped, well, you want to break out to something free of all those perverted forms. But Sri Aurobindo says something that he has always said, that there are the Godheads of the overmind who indeed are very similar. We have said this several times. Very similar to human beings. Infinitely greater and more powerful, but with resemblances which are a little too striking. So now she is explaining where this idea comes. In the overmental domain, which is the divine consciousness after it has divided itself, where different aspects of the divine powers or consciousness each now begins to be as if a separate power, a separate God or deity, and yet infinite, cosmic in its action, and different. So, infinitely greater and more powerful. But already by that time they've got individualized in form and limits. So this aspect also comes, that they're strikingly similar to the human. Beyond these, there is the impersonal Godhead, the impersonal divine. And beyond the impersonal divine, there is the divine, who is the person himself. So in the Sanskrit vocabulary, it is the Purushottama who transcends both the impersonal and the personal aspects, merges both, but that's the divine. And we must go through the impersonal to reach the supreme divine who is beyond. It's a very interesting idea now. If you see in the way the whole religion developed, it created this form of God which was a bit of a tyrant. And now in a reaction to it, there's an attempt to go beyond to an impersonal divinity. All love, all beauty, all grace, all harmony, all peace, all potential, but no form, at least minimalized in form. And then through that, the religion can further evolve to the true personality of the divine, which is all blissful, all inclusive. In the vocabulary of Sanskrit, we will say Krishna or Shri Krishna, the highest poise. Krishna, the word is, the root is Krish, which is Akarshana, the pulling movement, the attractive aspect of the divine. So the highest personality of the God is that which attracts the whole universe back to himself by power of love. And yet, he has this aspect of impersonality as well as personalities, and innumerable personalities equally. But that highest, the Purushottama, the ultimate or highest Purusha, being, person, is that. So, through the personal to reach the supreme divine who is beyond. Only it is good, as I said, for those who have been put by education into contact with too individual, too personal a God, to seek the impersonal divine. So if you've been through this too personal phase, it's good to seek the impersonal, because this liberates them from many superstitions. After that, if they are capable, they will go farther and have once again a personal contact with the divine, who indeed is beyond all these other Godheads. So that's it. That's what she had to say about. Just to conclude this aspect of the mother's comments, there are two portions which are somewhat strong in relation to the power of the church, particularly, and the Roman Catholic Church in particular. And she says about this in the agenda, two observations. One, she said that there is a certain occult power that it exercises through the baptism process itself, by which the force which is behind the church grips the mind of those who are taken through that occult ceremony. And it's very difficult after that to free from that force. It has a grip on the mind. It forms or warps the mind in a certain way because it's done at a very early age when the mind is not yet sufficiently developed. And then as it grows, the force is there like a mold, fixing it and warping it. That is one observation she makes. And then at the time of after Kennedy's assassination, she makes this comment that he was trying to make peace with Russia, and the force which is behind Catholic Christianity for the last few centuries did not like that. It did not want that peace to form. So here the reference is interesting. It's not talking about the Christ. It does not talk about the early phase of the church or Christianity, but the force which is behind this church for the last few centuries. And so suggesting that meanwhile there are many things which have come in and taken, so to say, control of this large machinery. And then there's one last comment where she says that and then she says, in France, and she tells this, I think in the agenda, she tells Sat Prem, in France, wherever people are searching for the spiritual experience, they quickly go back to Catholic Christianity. And then she says, and so that octopus still continues to have great force, a tremendous force. You get a hint there of the nature of the power which has gripped the machinery of the church. And she describes it as an octopus. It has these tentacles that reach out and grip. And then she says it's a pity, but anyway. But this is to show you, why am I pointing to these examples? To show you the necessity of that transition, where things in the religious form have degraded sufficiently that even other influences can creep in and seize the occult power behind the religion. It's almost as if necessary for the forms to be broken, or for the mind to go beyond those warped images of the divine, too narrow, too reduced, to break out to something impersonal, something wider, something freer. And so the necessity of that Protestant movement to break away. If not for that, there would be no vehicle to break out. But having had that, if too exaggerated, it tends to degrade and lose itself. And so you recognize the need to break away, and then something else in nature or from the divine help will lift or try to bring new element or new force of experience even in this corrective movement, drawing out elements which are relevant and rebuilding something more living and more true. And what is interesting is, in fact, one sees this happening, particularly in the last few decades. It's more obvious. People coming up, sometimes breaking out of traditional religions, but with a living experience, and around them something forms, something gathers and grows, where the focus is more on the living experience rather than too much of the ritual or the formality of the teaching. And if this can happen increasingly, then the awakening into the spiritual, even through the vehicles of the religion, will be much more stable. But if a religion refuses or opposes too strongly, we have the problems which we see today, including problems where religions even declare war or justify war in the name of their traditions and so on, which leads only to increased chaos. And you can see that religion cannot survive. And yet there are cores within the religion who will discover a living experience and break out into it. So this is the broad discussion around this point. And next time we will take up this other approach, a more synthetic approach of the principle of concentration and principle of diffusion. How is that possible? In what way can it be done? And it will be relevant for us, not just to understand the historical circumstances of the religion, but because actually that's what happens within us in our sadhana. We have many facets. In a sense, if you treat yourself as the religion, the body of religion, you have many facets within you which yearn to relate to the divine in each of their needs of satisfaction. And so can you grow in this multifaceted way? Yes, if a society can do it, if a religion can do it, of course, an individual equally. And each one then becomes his own unique religion. That's when you will recall Swami Vivekananda saying that as each religion divides itself more and more, eventually each person being his own religion, that is when you attain spirituality. But something of that insight you see developing in understanding this. So our purpose in understanding is not merely to understand what happened in the past, but to see the necessity in our own evolution and why this kind of the role of the intellect, what role it has to play to sift out, to draw out, but an intuitivized intellect, and how it can assist even in the higher turn through various steps, and how we can grow in this double movement of expansion as well as concentration. This has also practical reference to our community life, because in community living in a spiritual community, again, it has similarities to this movement of concentration and expansion, and many centers of concentration and many waves of expansion. And so very relevant to the ashram, to Auroville, and to the larger community of disciples of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother, which we continue next Sunday. We can meditate on this for half a minute.